Hi guys. So I know Patricia said you can keep your cameras off during the presentation, but as Diane said like about 2 minutes ago, if you can keep them on for reactions, that's really nice. I've presented online as well, and it's really difficult to just present to the normal emoji that you often have. Also feel free to use the react button if you like something. And then yeah, we'll have a question session at the end as always. Um, and then it's my great pleasure to introduce Diane. Um, I've followed him, I think about like a year and a half now on social media, and it kind of like feels like he's a local celebrity. Last year I went to one of Dan Corder's shows, and then he was like, "Guess who's in the audience?" So yeah, it's really cool and an honor for me to be able to introduce him. So he's an honors graduate. He graduated end of last year from UCT, and was in the environmental and geoscience department. Um, Currently, he's the chairperson for the Cape Family Research Forum and the deputy chairperson for the Western Cape Archives Advisory Council. Um, and yeah, I kind of like didn't specify too much what we want out of this talk, giving him a lot of space to think about what he could bring. So I'm also very excited to hear what he has to say tonight. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Mabet and Patricia. I'm going to try and make this talk as casual as possible. The first run of presenting this paper was at my thesis presentation in October 2024, and they only gave me 15 minutes to run through everything. So I'm trying to think of this as a rerun of around 3 years of research um, and 3 years of my life and my time that I've poured into this piece of work. Um, yeah, so it's titled Chronotopes of Colonialism and Freedom. And as I mentioned, it is my thesis topic that I did at UCT last year. Initially, I actually had a different thesis topic looking at how um, the Dutch made use of canalization as an early form of um, urban planning in the city. But while I was engaging in my formal studies at UCT, I was also doing my own research within local communities in terms of slavery, colonialism, political exile, and research into Islam at the Cape. And that then brings us into our second slide, which is Rondkrap as methodology and entry point. So Rondkrap is an Afrikaans word. It literally means to scratch around. And it was coined by uncles in my community who saw me scratching around in cemeteries and scratching around in family archives, looking for random things, trying to decipher texts that, in Cape Town, we've forgotten how to read for most people. In fact, most of us, including myself, actually had to learn some of these scripts and learn the vernacular and these things to actually try and understand it and to decode it. Um, but it was this practice of rondkrap, krapping rond, scratching around, trying to find things that stand out, things that might be in your face, but you don't notice them anymore. Um, and it then led me to this burial ground called the Tanabaru, which is situated on the slope of Signal Hill, just above Bukap. Um, and I mean, I've been acquainted with that site since I was about a child. My great-grandmother used to tell me stories about it. She was from a neighboring area called the Waterkant, and so she had visited the cemetery as a child with her grandmother. So there was a lot of family history, oral history attached to this specific site. Um, but in my own research, I started to visit the site, trying to decipher some of these tombstones, and we can actually see one of them that I've cropped out on the screen, and I'll explain it shortly. But in my practice of trying to decipher these tombstones, initially what I was doing is I was just simply reading the Arabic text on the tombstone and trying to connect the information about the individuals described on these tombstones with information that we can find in the colonial or in the provincial archive, the Western Cape archives, that I now sit on the advisory council of. And so I took a screenshot of this specific tombstone, and you can see in the backdrop is a photograph that I took of the Tanabaru Cemetery looking down at the City Bowl with Table Mountain in the background. And the screenshot of the tombstone sort of sits on top of where I found the exact tombstone, so you can sort of visually locate where it was in the burial ground. But I came across this specific tombstone and I began to translate it, and it became a very intimate and special interaction for me, because I think maybe around 4 or 5 years ago in 2021, I first came across this specific tombstone and I began to translate it. And it's written in Arabic script, but largely in the Malay language. And so in the top center, you can see what we call the basmala. So it's invocation of the name of God, but it's done in a very specific format. And I think one of my calligrapher friends, Fahim, joined the call this evening. He explained to me that the format that it was done in was in the shape of a ship. And it actually spoke directly to the culture that these people, these early Muslims, came from, right? They came out of slavery, they came out of exile from various ports throughout the Indian Ocean. So them coming here and bringing their maritime culture with them, they expressed it through these inscriptions on these stones. But again, that wasn't my primary focus. My primary focus was trying to figure out who the hell is buried in these graves. We know nothing really about these people, just the fact that these are our ancestors. We barely even know their names or anything about them. And so I started to translate this one. And the next line begins. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. I'm going to pretend you can't actually, just in case you actually can't. But it starts the first line declaring that there is no God but Allah, which is what Muslims call God, and that Muhammad, our Prophet, is the messenger of God. And then it's another declaration that indeed from God do we come and unto God do we return. It then begins by stating that the owner of this grave is Lady Rusta, right? And then it uses another word, Harima, which is broadly translated as a wife, but more understood in terms of within the sanctity or protection of, right? So we can understand that she's the wife of another individual by the name of Adalap or Adalp, something like that, right? So this script is very phonetic, so we couldn't quite figure out what the names were. And then it uses another word, which is Meningal. And if you're familiar with Kaaps or, Cape Town dialect, even Cape Muslims or Cape Malay culture, you might recognize this word Meningal as the still common word Maningal, which means to pass away or to die. So I grew up with this word uh, um, quite often when I was younger. If somebody dies, we don't say they died, we say they maningaled. So it was very familiar to me to see this word maningal. So then said that Maningal Dunya, she died or she left this world on Sambilan Hari on the ninth day, etc., etc. And as I mentioned, the script on here is very phonetic, right? So I mentioned two names, Rusta and Adalap, right? So I couldn't quite figure out who exactly these individuals were, but I parked it for a bit. In fact, I even sent a transcription of it to some scholars of Southeast Asian studies in other parts of the world, and they also couldn't translate it because of how contextualized these names were. And so I left it for a bit until maybe about a year and a half later. I was sitting in Boekamp, in fact, going through my own archive and my own research of death notices, so death documents from the Western Cape archives, and I came across a very specific death notice of a enslaved woman by the name of Rosetta van der Kaap. So she was born in the Cape and enslaved. And on this death notice, then stated that she was the wife of the late Adolf of the Cape. And it stated some details. She died in the year 1842. She was around 84 years old, something like that. And she had two children, Kandasa and Makhlouk. Um, and I was then looking at this death notice and I was reading the names and I was looking at the dates, and something just clicked that I have to go back to my archive of the Tanabaru tombstones that I had on my laptop. And I went to it and I was going through it, and this image popped up. And I was staring at both of them side by side. And I then realized that this phonetic spelling was, in fact, an attempt at trying to spell the Dutch slave names Rosetta and Adolf. And so we managed to piece together these two bits of information. And for the first time, in our community at least, we found the very first confirmed grave of an enslaved woman in our city, in Cape Town, and in our community as well. And then I did some further research and I found that Rosetta herself, her daughter Kandasa, and even Kandasa's three children were all listed on the same slave register owned by the Rede van Oudtshoorn family that lived sort of in the center part of Cape Town, where Rede Street of Kloof Street is today. That street is named after that family. And in fact, their patriarch is buried just adjacent to that site. So she was obviously enslaved by that family, both herself, her daughter, and her grandchildren. And so I'm not going to get into the psychological effects of what that does to oneself, one's household, and even generational trauma today. But coming back to our main theme of time, chronotopes, and my research, I then went back to this tombstone quite a number of times. And I think it was in June or July, just after a rainy evening, I went to the friend to the Tanabaru just to show them these graves and to show them this new discovered grave that I found, and how important it is in terms of also acknowledging our slave foremothers and the impact that they had on our existence as a community till today. There were a few other key points in the tombstone, for example, describing her as being an owner of that grave, right? So she being owned in her lifetime, but in her death, etched into stone, she's described as an owner of that site that nobody can take away from her, um, amongst other things. And so I kept staring at this tombstone and trying to make sense of it, trying to analyze as much as I can of the stone. And so I looked in the top left-hand corner and I saw the date. So you can see, again, I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, but you can see the date in Arabic numerals, which is from right to left, واحد اثنين خمسة and ثمانية. So 1258 in the Hijri calendar, so the Islamic calendar. And then it said Tahun, which is year, which I assumed was related to that specific year. And then after Tahun, there was another character that said Jim with three dots. I'm not sure if you can see, maybe Patricia, by a nod of your head, you can see this one, Jim with the three dots on top. And then just after that, it said Awal, which means first. And I kept looking at it and I tried to make sense of it in my mind. What could Jim Awal mean in this context? And it just didn't make sense. And so I dismissed it. I thought it's probably somebody just, scratching, messing around. They were taken from Southeast Asia, wherever they came from, came to Cape Town. Maybe they forgot how to spell in Arabic and they were just, trying their own luck in calligraphy. And so I left that for a bit. And I kept doing my research. I kept being busy with Rondkrap in the community. And I was invited by these two sisters that live in Lotus River. And they inherited a kist of manuscripts from their great great grandfather, who was an imam in Long Street. And his name was Imam Ismail. And so this imam, he collected manuscripts from the two imams that came before him. One of those imams was actually born into slavery, brought to the Cape emancipated and became an imam and a landed proprietor and quite an influential figure, even with local courts. Um, and so he began to collect these manuscripts dating back to around the 1790s. Um, and upon his death, his children, his son, then collected those manuscripts and manuscripts that were contemporary to him. And all of these manuscripts were then passed down in the family up until it moved from Longstreet to Salt River to other areas, eventually landing up with them in Lotus River. And so they were then sitting with this kist of kitabs, we call them, so manuscripts. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, the knowledge of the language, so Malay was lost in our community by this time. And also, to some extent, the knowledge of reading some of these manuscripts, even if it is in Arabic. Not everybody was able to read it. And so by this time, it then just became not meaningless, but um, incomprehensible manuscripts to these custodians. And so I was then doing this research and people heard about it and I think they posted somewhere. And eventually we came into contact and they sent me some images from their manuscript collection. And I felt that, these were quite important manuscripts, some scripts that I've actually never seen before, or scripts directly from Southeast Asia that are quite rare in the community. And I went to go check them out. And as I was going through this collection, looking at poetry, um, transcriptions, looking at prayer inscriptions, looking at some um, magic ciphers, I then came across this page that we see in front of us, which was a circle with a few words in it. So, for example, like the third word from the right is Gaja, um, which is, I think, a dragon. And so I was going through it and I realized that these were actually zodiac symbols, right? And so they were attempting to form or to draw a zodiac in the circle. But on the right-hand page, I was then looking at this and trying to make sense of it. And that's when I noticed that on the right-hand column, it is the names of all of the Hijri, so Islamic calendar months. So Muharram, and the next line is Safar, and then Rabi al-Awwal, Rabi al-Akhir. And then on the left-hand column was the Jawi. So Jawi is Malay written in Arabic. It was the Jawi spelling of the Gregorian calendar. So January, February, March, April, May. And so I could then understand that they were trying to sort of put these two calendar systems together to make sense of it, right? And my understanding at the time is that these early Muslims were living within a Hijri calendar system, so a Muslim calendar system, and were trying to then make sense of this in terms of a Gregorian calendar system. But then when I looked at the center column, on the third line, I see that same Jim symbol with the three dots that we saw on this tombstone. And then I thought, hang on, there's something going on here. That was definitely not coincidental that that guy wrote or inscribed that symbol onto that tombstone. It definitely had something to do with the date. And I got super excited. I didn't jump up and scream, but internally it was happening. Um, and I had a photographer friend with me, and I at least had somebody to share this excitement with because we were also busy on a heritage project around it. And so this was while I was busy with my first run at my thesis in around 2023 at UCT. And then I realized the importance of this manuscripts and these tombstones and these symbols, um, which then led me to change my thesis topic from looking at Dutch canonization in colonial Cape Town to looking at what are these weird, mysterious symbols that are beginning to pop up in Bo Kaap, in Lotus River, in Simonstown, in Mowbray, in Johannesburg, in Kimberley, in Port Elizabeth, all throughout South Africa and throughout the Cape. Um, and it then brought me to this thesis of an observation of what we can learn from informal archives relating to time of our enslaved and exiled people in Cape Town. or rather exiled Muslims in Cape Town formed a community in a colonial hegemonic system between around 1790 and 1890. And shortly after um, I did my first presentation, I actually changed the date from 1890 to around 1920 because re-looking at some of these manuscripts, I actually found later documents within the 20th century where people were still making use of these time systems, which through this presentation, I'm going to explain a bit more in depth. Can I get a time stamp, just so that I know where we are roughly? You're welcome to speak it
Yeah.
and
So
turn
we're
your mic.
about 20 minutes in now.
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
That's
I have
fine.
like
It
a
was a
little
very,
paper that I'll just flash. So
okay,
like
awesome.
between 15 and 30 right now.
Sure. Okay. It was a very long introduction, but I think it was necessary just to set the scene of why it was so important and why it's so niche and why it's so new as well to understand this calendar system. So I just wanted to put this image up. I'm going to leave it up for 30 seconds. Just look at it and try and comprehend it and let it disturb um, how you perceive time in your day-to-day life and current.
I don't know if it's I think he lost some signal. We'll just wait for him to come back.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi, I think the weather disrupted it very badly. Um,
It was a great like moment to leave us with like the
okay,
clock.
it wasn't by choice, but let me get back to it. Okay, can you see now?
Yes.
Okay, are we back on the clock?
Yes.
Let me just do my screen quickly. Okay. Um, so I just want to set some of the theory that I used for this project. which was the idea of the chronotope. So this concept of the chronotope was coined by a literary scholar by the name of Bakhtin. He was a Russian scholar. Um, and he speaks about chronotope sort of being these time-space parcels, right? So chronos meaning time, and top like topology and so on, referring or denoting space. So time, space together. And he mentions, or other scholars mention regarding this, that chronotopes of a narrative are also bridges that engage with parallel space-time frames in the real world. So although it came from this idea of being a literary device, other scholars then brought it into the real world, so to speak. And then I just have to read my notes because it's like very specific things. Um, but other urban scholars then brought this concept of the chronotope into urban planning, of how time is then made visible through space, and also being the space-time configurations that we see in everyday life, right? So this was the theory that I was working with. But being in the geography department that I was doing this project through, I also used another theory called time geography. Um, and time geography is different to chronotope as being the space-time, but rather time geography is this idea of looking at movement uh, in space through time, right? So how people or communities or societies move within particular space or between spaces across time, and using, or rather analyzing that for further research. So through my research, I then sort of brought these two concepts together, the chronotope, merged sort of into time geography. And then also in chronotype literature, this concept of heteroglossia kept popping up. And heteroglossia literally means diverse or multiple tongues, glossa, like your tongue, glossary, language, and so on. And one can understand its relation to chronotope, as chronotope being a literary device, and so heteroglossia, multiple tongues, multiple narratives within a story, how it goes together. And in doing my research, I then started to notice and realize how apt it was to make use of this device, of heteroglossia. And for me, I saw it as a multi-tongued history of Cape Muslim emergence in, or at the Cape rather. And so I then brought it into this idea of decolonial methodologies, where using the concept of the chronotope in highlighting the importance of looking at multiple voices within historical narrative, we can observe our main feature of Cape historiography is the Dutch colonial voice out of the official archive. And so through heteroglossia, we can excavate a nearly unnoticed archive kept within the Muslim community, or Cape Muslim community rather, that speaks with a different tongue to tell its own story, a story of perseverance, resistance, and existence. Yeah, and so that then brings us back to the material at hand, or the research findings, that is, right? So that's all that very long introduction that I was doing in the beginning of trying to explain how we got to this calendar and so on. Um, but looking at the Javanese calendar within the community's archive. So I sort of briefly explained the identification or the noticing of this specific calendar. And initially, I very much framed it as being a Hijri or a Muslim calendar. Um, but as I then started to do more and more research, looking at more tombstones, trying to configure dates, for example, this tombstone of Imam Jan van Bugis, for example, it was dated circa 1846. That's the year that he died, on his death notice. And when you go to his tombstone, can you see my cursor? I just want to know. No, you can't see it. Okay, that's fine. But you do see that glyph in the bottom center with the 6 dots on top of it.
We can see it now.
Okay.
If you move it, we
My,
can see it, I think. Yeah.
my cursor.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So you see this glyph over here with the 6 dots. Just above that, it also gives the date that this guy died, right? This imam was also the same imam that the collection came from, by the way. But when we try to translate that date from Malay into English and then figure out the numbers and convert it to the Islamic calendar, we saw that it wasn't matching. So something wasn't making sense as to why would there be a mismatch between the Hijri to Gregorian date conversions if that's the calendar they were using. That then brings us to this document on the left-hand side, which is an explanatory text from the Imam Ismail collection, and it's from around the 1870s. And this text itself, I could tell from all of the other texts in the collection, was written by Imam Ismail himself. So it was written by the ancestor of these two sisters, which they were unaware of at the time. And what he actually does is he lists each symbol at the top. So the first one is sort of cut out, but it's the symbol of Alif, which will have 1 dot. And then it's the symbol of Ha, which has 4 dots. And then Jim, that we've seen a few times before, with 3 dots. Za, which has 7 dots. Dal with 4 dots. Ba with 2 dots. Waw with 6 dots that we see over here. And then Jim with 3 dots again. And so we see Jim is repeated twice. And so that's why in the beginning, Jim Awal was described as being the first Jim, and the second Jim over here on other tombstones that I noticed was described as Jim Akhir, or the second Jim. And he then goes on to describe, he says, Ya itu nama dan huruf tahun, ada punya tahun ita delapan. So he says that these are the names and the letters of the years, and they are 8, right? And he then begins to say that tahun alif, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, perfect. Tahun alif is the first one, and then secondly is tahun ha over there, and thirdly is tahun jim, and he begins to list all 8. So then we begin to understand that there are 8 of these symbols in total. And again, at the time, I didn't quite understand what this calendar was. I just started noticing that it was a calendar that these people were using in Cape Town, my ancestors that I had no idea about. And I then started to do some research. Google Scholar is our best friend. And I found that this was, in fact, called the Javanese calendar. And the Javanese calendar is still in use in Java, in Indonesia, till today, very widespread. In fact, it's the national calendar of Indonesia. And so I started to realize that, or not started to realize rather, actually, when I went to the research and went to do the readings, I discovered, or I found out, or rather I learned that during pre-colonial times, there were various Hindu South Indian empires that had gone across the Indian Ocean to Indonesia and extended their empires into that area and brought with them an ancient cyclic Hindu calendar called the Saka calendar, right? And the Saka calendar had 8-year cycles, like we see in this one. It had 100-year cycles. It had 5-day weeks, 8-day weeks, 5 days for a market day, 8 days for an agricultural week, and so on. And we can understand how there are these sort of nested cycles within cycles that created the sort of never-ending loop of ancient Indic timekeeping. And by around the 15th century, there was a sultan on the island of Java that embraced Islam, and he took this old Saka calendar and he combined it with the Islamic Hijri calendar to form the new Javanese calendar, being based on the island of Java. And so as Islam spread throughout Nusantara, throughout Southeast Asia, this specific calendar became widespread, spreading into places like Sulawesi, where many enslaved people were brought from, to the Cape, like Makassar, and also places like Ternate. And why this is so important is that the founder of the Cape Muslim community at the Cape was an exile uh, that was exiled from this island of Ternate in around 1780 to the Cape. And so he brought this calendar system with him, and he began to teach it in what we can consider as the first non-racist, non-racial, non-classist school in Dorp Street in Buka, which eventually became the Awal Madrasa, or the first school, and then also the Awal Masjid, or the first mosque, right? And so we can then start to understand how this calendar then became popularized from this space onwards. Um, and in the research, I just want to check next. Yeah. So in the research, I then started also to look at different comprehensions of time, different understandings of time. And there was a lot of literature around this idea of Western time framing and Eastern time framing. And as I mentioned already, Eastern time was very much a cyclic time. It was a natural time in that it very much took into consideration your natural seasonal cycles. Even in terms of our daily cycles, right? So with sunrise as being a key part of telling time, sunset as being a key part in telling time, and even till today in how we relate as Muslims within our community is whenever we have events, we won't say we'll meet at 6 o'clock. We'll say we'll meet after Maghrib. And Maghrib is a prayer time, but it's also sunset time. So it's this relating in terms of seasonal time. Whereas if we look at Western time was very much seen as linear time based on the clock, and it was chronological. Um, and again, Eastern time is sort of being seen as outside of the human reality, and we just sort of exist within these cycles that take place naturally. And then furthering on from this discussion, I then started to look at how the Dutch and even the later British then started to make use of time as a uh, oppressive tool. And so there was one scholar that looked at time in antebellum South in America and in the context of slavery. And he suggested that, like the body is held captive through the chain, the mind is held captive through time, where this is bounded by the ringing of the slave bell. And so we can very much and very easily look at it in the context of Cape Town, where you had a Gregorian time system, you had clock time, and we still have these slave bells on display throughout the colony, throughout South Africa, even at Rustenburg Girls Primary School within the main hall. That bell is still standing there, reminiscent of um, the violence that it caused just through its ringing, as reinforcing slavery, reinforcing labor, and reinforcing oppression. And then sort of to what's the word, propose this idea is looking at time and freedom. And then, I was thinking around this idea of, by resisting the Gregorian clock time, which was used to enslave, we can rather look at the Javanese calendar and prayer time as an alternative to this, where there was a persistence to claim time, or rather to claim identity and to form community. And so, in context, Cape Muslim religious and cultural practice was not just tolerated by the Dutch and British, but they had resisted oppression actively through alternate temporal existence. And so what I sort of meant by this in my thesis, sorry, it was a very rushed grabbing from the actual thesis. There was a sentence missing there. Um, but yeah, so what I was looking at is how, by making use of the chronotope as being like this space-time capsule, right? And looking at these early spaces that they collected themselves inside, whether it was in a home, whether it was in a mosque, whether it was in the madrasa, the school in Dorp Street or in Bree Street or in Simonstown, um, it sort of allowed for them to form these chronotopes, where although it's still within the colonial space, within the colony, and still under Gregorian, uh, the hold of Gregorian time, adjacent, but also inside of that, they could form these chronotopes where they could exist within the Javanese time and within a space that they could control. And so, even though Islam was banned as a religion up until around, I think it was like 1807, with the lifting of the Statutes of India. And even though we also find in literature around Islam at the Cape this idea of Islam being tolerated by the Dutch, I argue that instead of it just being tolerated, Cape Muslims were very much aware um, of what they were doing and how they were collecting themselves, and were being very mindful and conscious of how they existed within time. It wasn't just this arbitrary time system that they brought to Cape Town, but it was very much a calculated time system. It wasn't just something that the 8 years cycle continues, but you have to constantly calculate, you have to constantly think, you have to constantly look at how the moon rises and sets, how the sun sets, how the constellations shift throughout the year, how the tides change, right? So it is very much in tune with nature, in tune with the sky, in tune with your own intuition, but also making use of science and mathematics. And why I so comfortably use this phrase of resistance, even though it can be critiqued, is that I found a quote from 1825 from an imam who was born into slavery. And he had become a teacher in that area at the time in Strand Street. And he was asked by the Pigs Commission, um, who was inquiring about Islam in the colony. And they asked him, tell us about slavery in your community. And very eloquently he replies, and he says that, when they come into the community and into the mosque space, though they are enslaved, their souls are free, and they must look up to God to free them in their death. And I think this encapsulates this entire thesis um, by granting us a glimpse into the mind of these people in that very time, where we don't have access to them anymore. We don't know much about their personal lives and their social life from the colonial archive. Um, but from this one example of a phrase, we can get a glimpse into how they saw themselves as being free within their own chronotope, despite the colonial hegemony and the reality of slavery at the time. I then just wanted to bring in another significant find in this research outside of the main theme that I was running with. Um, so in looking at these manuscripts in relation to time, I then came across this other manuscript that we can see on the left, and it was very similar to this one on the left over here. So it was sort of circular, and we see these words like gaja, we see ikan, fish, we see shaitan, which is devil, and so on. And so coming back to this one, we see a lot of these similar names coming up. We see gaja again at number 12 over there. It's written in the Arabic numerals. We see shaitan again at number 20, orang, person, at number 21, and so on. But through further analysis, we then look at this pentagram in the middle, and the pentagram, each point is pointing to two different names at each point, right? So in the outer circle, it's actually referring to names of what was originally Hindu and then became Javanese gods. So on the left is Vishnu, which is Vishnu, and then Brahma, and then Siri, and then Kala or Kali. And then there was another one at the top, which I'll explain shortly. And in the inner circle, at the top is Muhammad, so the Islamic prophet, and then Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, which are seen as his four successors, right? And in the third inner circle, so like just between the names and the pentagram, we see a rectangle, a triangle, a weird symbol, and another weird symbol over there. And what it appeared was that they were then converting these older religious systems to the new religious systems and using these symbols as the code for these conversions, right? So when you convert from Vishnu to Abu Bakr, you then use the triangle. And then when we look at these zodiacs in the semicircle on the outer part, each day, so it's around 30 or 31 in total, each day is then symbolized by a different element, a different animated being, a different animal, a different emotion. And they then use around 5 different configurations of these specific symbols for each element. Now, even through doing research, I still couldn't completely figure out what the hell is going on in this symbol conversion thing over here. But what I did begin to understand just with the name conversions from the old names to the new names, I started doing research into some of these. And I noticed that when they referred to Muhammad, they used a name by the name of Musar, right? And that name doesn't exist in Javanese mythology. But there is another um, uh, being that exists by the name of Semar. So I assume that it must have sort of been a flipped form or lost in transoceanic movement, where the Semar was sort of seen as a creator being, or not a creator being, a very important being. I can't remember exactly what this god's position was, but it was sort of seen as very similar to how the Prophet Muhammad was viewed. I think the god Semar was actually the human embodiment of God on earth, something like that. And so it was sort of seen as this divine being that is also human amongst us. And this almost done. This these conversions were very similar to a hikayat or a storytelling um, art called or sorry, the storytelling art is called hikayat. So it was very similar to a hikayat of an individual by the name of Ajisaka. And Ajisaka was his story is also seen as one of the founding stories of the Javanese people in Southeast Asia. But within one of these Ajisaka stories, he's also used as a, how can I say, like a parable. So Ajisaka in different stories to tell you, to teach you about different morals and so on. And in one of these stories, it speaks about how he meets this god Semar and meets all these other people. And then it gets retold about how he meets the Prophet Muhammad when going on pilgrimage to Mecca and all these other people. And so we can understand that even in Java, they then started to do these conversions. And through this system over here on the left, we can then see how they retained these stories from Java and from Southeast Asia, coded it into the time systems, and managed to bring it across the Indian Ocean to the Cape, where today we have very little of these stories within our community, apart from the things that were created here, right? Stories that come from Pukap or Claremont or so on, but very, very little of our folk stories that we actually brought with us from Southeast Asia. And through this manuscript, I actually managed to understand or at least decode that they did bring these stories with them, but they then coded it within this very complex time system, these cyclic time systems, um, to allow them to preserve it within this very colonial and oppressive system that they found themselves in Cape Town. And so what does this all mean? I spoke a very lot of words today, but basically in around 3 sentences, I was looking at the significance of enslaved people carrying and preserving a form of indigenous knowledge. I also looked at an understanding of how alternative practices of time can be a form of resistance and enforcing agency, a persistence to hold on to culture and identity. And for me, most importantly, through my own identity and through existing literature around Islam at the Cape, um, and discourse around it, that Cape Muslims were not just tolerated, but they resisted oppression actively through alternative temporal existence. And then just finally touching on the idea of heteroglossia and the archive. I just want to check which page. Yeah. So with Heteroglossia in the archive and through this project of mine, through the work, I felt that instead of seeing it as myself actually doing the work and doing the research, I was just krapping around. I was just scratching around, and I managed to at least make a space that can connect the past with the present, create a chronotope, as one of the previous scholars said. Chronotopes of a narrative are also bridges that engage with parallel space-time frames in the real world. And so through this chronotope, I managed to create a bridge, or at least create a passage from the past to the present, where these people could speak for themselves, where we can dismiss the colonial voice using the colonial and formal archive, and appreciate the informal archive, appreciate and acknowledge and see the archives that we have and the archives that our own ancestors had preserved through tombstones, through manuscripts, through photographs, and allow them to speak for themselves instead of even us as a descendant community speaking for them today. And so I just wanted to leave you with these two photographs. On the left is an individual by the name of Bilal Basarin, and on the right is my mama and my papa, my great-grandparents, on their wedding day in 1951. And I was largely raised by them in my youth, and it was through their stories, their bedtime stories, and my mama showing me her photos and telling me about the Tana Baru, going up there with her grandmother, and spook stories about Bukap and so on, that inspired me to delve into my own heritage. And on the left is a photo of her great-grandfather, who was likely an enslaved man. And you can see by the clothing, very contemporary to the 19th century, to the free black or freed slave community. And so this project was sort of an homage to the broader community, but also to my own ancestors and the people that raised me, and this direct link that I have to the people that made use of these systems and ensured that these systems were preserved until we could come along and remember them and make space and time for them. Thank you.
That was really cool. I think let's quickly take some questions. If anyone has a question, and please turn on your camera when you ask a question, and also your mic when you ask a question.
Rebecca, do you see there's one in the question and answer section from Helen?
Right. Missed that. It's still loading on my side. Do you want to ask, Patricia?
So Helen says, amazing. What rich research.
Can I just qualify quickly if it is Helen Joannides? Helen is from the archives, and I'm very much a supporter of the archives. I do love our archives that we have here. And sitting on the advisory council, you know, I'm very much, and Mary as well, all for making use of the archives and preserving our archives. But, you know, this just was a way of looking at other forms of archives that are also as valid and as important as well. Yeah.
You don't need to qualify that at all, Dave. Excellent research. We're so amazing to have the formal colonial archive reimagined in other ways, and that's what it's all about.
Awesome, thank you. I'm just going to stop the recording quickly.